panel is telling the stories of the Korea, critical approaches to historical narrative. And we have really three really riveting, interesting panel presentations that you will hear. We'll go in the order of the program. Everybody has about 12 minutes or something to speak. And then we also have our discussant who will give comments. And then also you in the audience, really prepare the questions you might have. We will have sufficient time to have a good conversation. So first up, we start with Jae In-ho from Seoul National University here. Strange Politics in Early Modern East Asia, the Objective Value of Fictionalized History.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, first of all, for coming here, and also thank you, Olivia, for accepting to chair the panel. So I'm going to talk about Strange Politics in Early Modern East Asia, the Objective Value of Fictionalized History. So in this presentation, I'd like to introduce a form of strange politics in early modern Korea and argue that in order to properly interpret this type of strange politics, it is necessary to go beyond the strict boundary between historical fact and fictionalized history. So it's half theoretical and also half empirical study. This approach will also have a crucial implication in the narratives we tell about Korea's pre-modern past, which I believe is fitting to the entire theme of this conference. So, from the perspective of modern politics, strange forms of politics were quite common in the pre-modern period. So, for example, there was an actual conception and practice of divine governed by God in the medieval Europe. And in Tibet, early modern Tibet, the rulers such as Dalai Lama was and still is conceived as reincarnated Buddhas or reincarnated sagely monks. And in pre-modern Korea, Koreans maintained the loyalty to the Ming court and emperor as their fatherly sovereign, which looks quite strange, especially for modern Koreans. The Korean case is the focus of my presentation, and this picture depicts an altar that the Koreans built to conduct a memorial rite for the Ming emperors after the Ming had collapsed. They have conducted this rite for nearly 200 years. It shows the enduring conception of the Ming as the fatherly sovereign even after the Ming had disappeared. The record during the Ming-Qing transition period explicitly says that the Ming was like a father to Joseon. So, for example, this record by royal lecturer says, the relationship between our country and the celestial court is one of ruler and subject in principle, and of father and son in affection. How could one hear a report that one's lord and father is under military attack? During this period, Ming was under military attack by the Qing, and dismiss it as merely the boastful words of savages, without being moved in one's heart. The conception of Ming as a fatherly sovereign is quite strange to modern ears accustomed to modern conception of sovereignty. So in the conventional view, these strange forms of politics have no substantial reality on the ground. It usually functions simply as an ideology or symbolic estimation of rulers. And it is a result of the pre-modern belief system. Thus, it has no real substance to it. However, this conventional understanding does not grasp the experienced reality of these strange forms of politics. And I argue that in order to understand the experienced reality behind strange non-modern politics, we need their fictional reconstructions. First, we need to reconstruct what it feels like to participate in strange politics beyond the necessarily incomplete written record. Through fictional reconstruction, we need to recreate emotion, feeling, and aspiration of historical actors that exist beyond the recorded history. Also, through fictional reconstruction, one can insert strange politics in the contemporary horizon of reality, enabling the modern people to experience the non-modern politics in the modern world. Things that existed in the reality of the past but not in the reality of the present can become accessible through fictional reconstruction. So in short, the objective value of history, I argue, is determined by both fictionalized experience of the past and the accurate use of the material evidence. To recover the reality of the strange past, we need to acknowledge the objective value of both fiction and factual evidence. This argument is based on two theories about historical and fictional realities. First, Hayden White's work have shown that fictional narrative is constitutive of any historical truth. Thus, a historian's task is not to produce a merely accurate account of an event, but to create an artistic or fictional treatment of a real event, which reaches the truth of historical experience beyond the factual truth of accurate accounts. Also, Marcus Gabriel's ontological pluralism demonstrates why you can also attribute objective value to fictionalized history. He argues that there is no all-encompassing world, but only multiple fields of sense that are populated by different sets of existing objects. Thus, fictional characters exist in stories just as ordinary things exist in our field of sense, because a fictional story is also a field of sense. Objective existence of things simply depends on appearance in a field of sense. Thus, the only way that a past historical reality can obtain actual existence is to appear in a fictional story, which is a distinct field of sense itself. A past reality is in principle non-existent in our everyday field of sense. It is only by the mediation of another field of sense, the fictionalized history, that the non-existent past reality recovers its existence in the field of sense accessible to us. So now I'll illustrate the objective value of fictionalized history by fictionalizing the 1637 Qing invasion of Korea. Qing invaded Joseon Korea to force the Koreans to sever its tie with the Ming and serve the Qing as the new son of heaven. However, the majority of Korean ruling elites argued that their country should resist the Qing even if it meant the collapse of their state. The prospect of submitting to the Qing generated enormous emotional upheaval in the Korean court. So, for example, King Injo wept and said, "For 300 years we have served the great state," meaning Ming, "with utmost sincerity, receiving profound and weighty grace. And now, in a single morning, we are to become slaves and concubines to our enemy and barbarian foes. How can this not be a source of unbearable pain? Who could have imagined that it would all end up being like those goats and birds?" So in this quote, the emotional toll of losing the tie to Ming, China, was so great that the king wept in front of his ministers. Furthermore, the Koreans equated the survival of their state with their proper relation with the Ming. For example, one minister demonstrated that if they were to order, meaning the Qing, "Your Highness to surrender," would Your Highness then surrender? If they were to command you to change your attire and serve wine, would Your Highness then serve wine? If you do comply, then the state is already lost. Rather than perish on bended knee, would it not be better to uphold righteousness and die for the altars of state? So the complying with the Qing is identical to losing the state itself. Thus, it is better to die while keeping the state intact till the last moment. Existing accounts of contemporary accounts of this event see this Korean resistance in various ways. First, many see the Korean resistance as an example of the dangers of entrenched ideology, which kept the Korean from accommodating the Qing's demand and thereby protecting their own national interest. Another views this as a dedication to their fatherly sovereign Ming, or it is a consequence of their idealistic devotion to the Sinic civilization, rights, or moral principles. So these accounts are partially correct, but they are also insufficient interpretation because they largely miss the experiential truths beyond the written record and only provide abstract explanations that are still hard for modern people to understand within their lived reality. So with a fictionalized version of the event, one can have a better sense of what it would have been like to be Koreans in the situation, and here is one such account of Injo's previous lamentation I made up. So this is the same scene of the Injo weeping, but I kind of fictionalized this scene. So with a contorted face, the king sobbed as he forced out his words. 300 years, for 300 years, we have served the great state with blood and devotion. And how deep was the grace we received in return? Tears streamed down his cheeks, tracing the deep lines etched around his closed eyes. And now, in a single morning, we become vassals, slaves to those barbarian foes. How could such a thing be? How can this anguish be endured? After pushing the words out through breath choked with grief, the king shut his eyes. Between muffled sobs, a heavy silence settled over the outer hall of the temporary palace. The sleeves of the minister's gloves fluttered softly in the winter wind, slipping in through the cracks in the doors. So with this fictional account, I attempted to render Injo's feeling more lively and easier to sympathize with. Also, I created a more concrete scene so that the readers can project themselves into the world of the Koreans in their desperate situation. Also, in order to create the sense of having a fatherly gray state in the contemporary world, I created a fictional dialogue between the Korean minister and the US Secretary of State in 2035. So the Korean foreign minister, I hope the president is keeping well. I'm always deeply sorry that both you and the president are losing sleep over the affairs of a small and idle nation like ours. The US Secretary of State, how could the president and I spare an effort? We've been entrusted posts beyond our station with a vast land and can hardly help but be constantly on the move. But with an ally like Korea, we count ourselves truly fortunate. Is there any nation more devoted in heart to following the will of heaven and earth than Korea? Yeah, I know it's very funny to our ears, but here both countries are respectful to each other regardless of their size. It is possible because both consider their countries not as their property, but as their duty. And because they believe their governments are accountable to the will of heaven and earth, which refers to planetary processes such as climate change in this fictional setting. So these fictional accounts render the strange politics of early modern Koreans both more universal and unique. Once one grasps their experience, feelings, and aspirations through fiction, then their seemingly irrational resistance becomes just another case of quite common human struggle to retain dignity under the pressure of insurmountable violence. But it is also unique because it is a struggle to keep a distinct non-modern value of serving the great. So in its universality, their struggle is comparable to other examples of resistance against oppression that we commonly see in the modern politics of democratization. For example, here is a statement by a civil resistance militia during May 18 Gwangju Democratic Uprising. God, why do I have a conscience that pierces and hurts me like this? I want to live. So the person on the one hand wants to preserve his life, but on the other hand cannot ignore the command of his conscience. Likewise, Koreans during the Qing invasion of course wanted to preserve their regime and survival, but at the same time they could not ignore the ingrained moral command to keep their righteous tie with the Ming. So this struggle, I believe, is what Kim Sang-hwan, the main advocate of the fight against the Qing, wanted to express in his letter to Kim Yu. He says, looking back on the mere things of the world, what can truly be called real and what false? Wealth and honor, fame and splendor, right and wrong, praise and blame, none are worth clinging to. If slander comes from those without understanding, let them prattle on as they wish. 1,000 years from now, surely there will be someone who understands my mind. So he expresses his indifference to others' evaluation on whether his actions were right or wrong, a surprising statement given his fierce resistance against the surrender. But still, he is sure that the later generations will understand his mind. And this mind, it seems to me, is nothing other than his moral struggle to retain his human dignity under the violence of the Qing invasion. So in sum, fictional history is necessary for recovering the lived reality of strange politics in the pre-modern world. The the application of fictional approach to the Korean case shows that the resistance against the Qing is but an example of a common human struggle to afford moral dignity. That's all. Thank you for listening.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for this great opportunity to share my research and get some comments from the audience and Dr. Jie Song. So today I'm going to share my research paper on East Asia and Korea in pre-modern period. So international relations is now, as a discipline, is now undergoing another wave of historical turn. So the relative decline of the Western dominance and the emergence of non-Western powers have prompted IR scholars to investigate the history of various regional orders, including the European one, as well as the interactions among those regional orders. And in particular, East Asia has gained prominence among IR scholars because this region had developed a distinct regional order for many centuries, even long before it was integrated into the globalized Westphalian international system. And the study of historical East Asia has sparked many debates and dialogues regarding anarchy, hierarchy, and more broadly, the organizing principle of the international system, and the significance of cultural factors in international relations, and finally, the various mechanisms of state formation. So all these dialogues are now challenging the conventional wisdom in international relations. While China has played a central role in East Asia for many centuries, Korea is also attracting scholarly interest. This is because Korea most frequently interacted with China and was heavily influenced by it, but paradoxically, it has maintained political autonomy and independence for many centuries. So in IR literature on East Asian history, Korea is often portrayed as a model tributary state of the Chinese Empire. And this image was drawn from the highly stable and institutionalized relationship between Joseon Korea and the Ming and Qing empires. But overgeneralizing the case of Joseon Korea can be misleading because it reifies the image of historical East Asia as a hierarchical system underpinned by Chinese hegemony and Confucianism, without due consideration for key differences across historical eras. So, archaeological evidences indicate that the Korean peninsula was already inhabited in prehistoric times. And indigenous peoples and societies in Korea developed various patterns or types of relationships with their continental neighbors, including the Chinese dynasties. Unfortunately, historical IR scholars are now extending the scope of analysis to ancient Korean polities that existed before the Joseon dynasty. So here are some key differences. The first one is that the historical East Asia oscillated between a hegemonic system and a multi-state system. And both the Chinese heartland and the Korean peninsula were often divided and ruled by different kingdoms or polities, and they underwent the cycles of division and unification as a result. And second, Confucianism is often regarded as the key dominant ideology underlying the peace and stability and Chinese hegemony in historical East Asia. But the degree to which Confucianism was adopted and internalized varied across countries and varied across time. So even in Korea, Confucianism was not always such a dominant political ideology as it would later become during the Joseon dynasty. So in this vein, I will revisit historical East Asia from a Korean perspective and offer more nuanced understanding of the region. So it will help IR scholars further historicize historical East Asia. Especially, I'll examine the problems of war and conflict, Chinese hegemony, and state formation in the region during the so-called Three Kingdoms period in Korea. It lasted from the 57 BCE to 676 CE. So for this research, I relied on the Korean sources that have been underused in IR scholarship, such as 삼국사기, 삼국유사, and stone inscriptions on stone monuments, like the Stele of King Gwanggaeto and Chungju Goguryeo monuments. So first, I examined the frequency and intensity of political violence in the Three Kingdoms period, based on 삼국사기. So, as a very rough measure for the minimum number of battles that involves at least one of the ancient Korean kingdoms, I counted the number of articles in 삼국사기 that recorded battles. And each article contained a single battle or a series of interrelated battles. So, according to this count, Goguryeo waged at least 151 battles, Baekje fought 121, and Silla waged 183. Also, in 242 years out of the 733 years of the Three Kingdoms period, the population on the Korean Peninsula experienced one or more incidents of political violence. And 삼국사기 also helps us identify the pattern of enmity and alliance in ancient Korea. So Goguryeu's major threat came from the continental dynasties that ruled the Chinese heartland and northern China. Its main ally was Malgar, the semi-nomadic tribe society in Liaodong and Manchuria. In the case of Baekje, its major enemy was Silla. But interestingly, Silla was also Baekje's principal alliance partner. Similarly, Shilla's major threat and major alliance partner was Baekje. So all these records and statistics show that historical East Asia, especially during the Three Kingdoms period on the Korean Peninsula, the region was not so peaceful and stable. Second, it is also worth noting that historical East Asia was not always a hierarchical system under Chinese hegemony. So the Chinese, as I mentioned before, the Chinese heartland and northern China were divided by multiple and competing regimes, and the Korean Peninsula, especially Goguryeo, took advantage of this geopolitical circumstance. For instance, Goguryeo frequently sent tributary missions to powerful continental neighbors, such as the Northern Wei, but these continental neighbors did not treat Goguryeo as their subordinate. Rather, Goguryeo engaged in tribute investiture relationships with multiple continental dynasties at the same time. And by doing so, Goguryeo could reinforce its diplomatic and strategic leverage within the multi-state system. And on the other hand, Goguryeo sought to build a hierarchical system that positioned itself at the center and the top. So in particular, Goguryeu's relationship with Silla in Korea reached a high level of institutionalization. For instance, the kings of Goguryeo called Silla Eastern barbarians and treated Shilla's rulers as their subordinates. And Goguryeu's army was stationed within Silla territory and often intervened in Shilla's domestic politics. Also, Silla sent young princes or high noble bonds to Goguryeo court as their hostages. So in sum, Goguryeu's relationships with its continental and peninsular neighbors show that historical East Asia was not always a hierarchical system under Chinese hegemony, especially when the Chinese heartland and the northern China were divided. And finally, war preparation played a very crucial role in state formation in ancient Korea. So, although Silla had been the weakest among the three kingdoms in earlier centuries, so it became the final victor by destroying Baekje and Goguryeo in the late 7th century. So, as you can see from these tables, the rise of Silla in the 6th and the 7th centuries occurred in tandem with the development of bureaucracies for resource extraction and war. So, if you look at the table on the left, it counted the number of battles waged by the three ancient kingdoms in Korea in the 6th and 7th centuries. The interesting thing is that if you look at the case of Goguryeo, Goguryeo waged 16 battles in total, and whenever Goguryeo faced the Silla army on the battlefield, Goguryeo always experienced defeats. And in the case of Baekje, if you look at the table, you can see Baekje was mainly on the defensive side. But the problem here is that whenever Baekje initiated a war against the Silla, it was always defeated. And interestingly, there are 9 battles waged by Silla, and in every battle, Silla took the victory. So this table provides a very brief indicator about Shilla's rise. relative to Goguryeo and Baekje in the 6th and 7th centuries. And the table on the right side shows the timetable about Shilla's bureaucratic development. So if you look at the title of the department of government agencies created in this period, you can see it is more about political centralization and wartime resource mobilization. So these tables show us that the development of bureaucracy and war preparation and Shilla's war-making capabilities, they were all interrelated to one another. And the significance of a war in state formation in the case of Shilla is also supported by the rise of warrior rulers who are all known as the Hwarang. These warrior rulers were a group of young elites from noble houses. And they were trained as the generation of future leaders who would lead and unite the country. And in particular, this Hwarang elite group, they were expected to lead the Shilla army on the major battlefields. So Kim Yu-shin and his family were a dramatic case that illustrates the rise of these warrior rulers. Originally, Kim Yu-shin was a descendant of a small kingdom of Gaya, which was annexed by Shilla in the 6th century. But later, he proved his military capability and became the major general of the Shilla army. So he proved his capability as the military commander in the battlefields, in numerous battles, especially defensive wars against Baekje and Goguryeo. And Kim Yu-shin was also blessed with political sensibility. He married his sister to a talented young prince, Kim Chun-chu, who later became King Muyeol of Shilla in 654 CE. And for the next few generations, Kim Yu-shin and his family became the most prestigious house in Shilla, allied with the crown by marriage. So the case of Kim Yu-shin also tells us the significance of war and warrior rulers in state formation in ancient Korea. So the study of ancient Korea and its kingdoms based on Korean sources help higher scholars develop a more nuanced understanding of historical East Asia. So first, the historical East Asia was not so peaceful and stable as portrayed in the existing literature on the region. Also, there existed multiple tribute investiture systems which were designed to promote the interest of not just the Chinese dynasties, but also non-Chinese actors. Finally, war played a very important role in state formation in ancient Korea. So all these points demonstrate that we need to further historicize historical East Asia itself, rather than treat it as a static, hierarchical system under Chinese hegemony and Confucian dominance. So I will stop here, and thanks for listening.
Hello, my name is Sophie Yanhee Kim. I'm based in Seoul University. And today I'll be talking about digital detente, rethinking CBMs with North Korea. Now, what are CBMs? It's confidence building measures. So CBMs are diplomatic mechanisms designed to prevent the escalation of conflict between adversarial states by enhancing transparency, predictability, and communication. Originating during the Cold War, CBMs were instrumental in diffusing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The conceptual framing of CBMs was first introduced by Johann Jürgen Holst. He primarily conceives of CBMs within military security and defines it as, quote, an arrangement designed to enhance such assurance of mind and belief in the trustworthiness of states and the facts they create, right? So CBMs came out in the context of the modern world state system and in the context of security dilemma, right? What happens when two states nuclearize or have certain military capabilities to attack each other, right? And they're generally in a state of war. So when you're in a state of war, you need to have some form of diplomacy, whether or not you're still in conflict. So CBMs came out from Helsinki, and it came out from a very European-centric framework of how do we de-escalate tensions in the context of the Cold War. So it's largely thinking in relation to Europe, NATO, and Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time. But largely CBMs are also situated within a realist worldview that asserts that international political system is fundamentally anarchic. Anarchic in the sense that there's individual and autonomous states, and they are in a self-help system, right? So they're first-generation CBMs arising from the 1975 Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, it's CSCE, and second generation, which expands from military trust to non-military trust building. And so what happens is during the Cold War, this framework gets adopted in the context of the Korean Peninsula. So this report is tools for confidence building, and even currently, Lee Jae-myung, right, is using a lot of the language around 신뢰 구축, right, trust building. That's actually a CBM framework. So this, I guess this topic in many ways emerged while I was in Hawaii doing my PhD, and I was working on a End the War campaign in Hawaii, and a lot of it was organizing around US foreign policy in North Korea. And of course, what we know, there's this kind of history of when CBMs were first executed, right, in Korea. And so it's from 1953, so starting from the Armistice Agreement, the 1972 Joint Communique. So it's during, the height of the Cold War in South Korea and North Korea. And then this evolves into the basic agreement around denuclearization, and then the 2018 Panmunjom Declaration. So all of this is part of instituting de-escalating tensions in the context of inter-Korean relations. Now, so while I was working on the campaign, we know what happened with the 2019 Hanoi summit. It didn't go through, right? So Trump and Kim Jong-un were not able to come to agreement about how to so-called denuclearize. And a lot of it was predominantly around the issues of economic sanctions and whether North Korea itself had the financial system to intake foreign investments. And so while I came to South Korea, I was meeting with a lot of the civil society activists and former government people. And I was sort of asking, why do you think the Hanoi summit failed? Like, why are the reasons for it, right? And there are different variations, but I think mostly internally it was because there's a lack of consistency, at least in South Korea. So the North Korea always sends the diplomats, same diplomats with 30 years of history. South Korea, 4 years, every diplomat changes. So the North Korean counterpart is always like, hey, do you remember what we agreed on last time? And they're like, no, I'm a new person, right? So there is a lack of institutional memory in the context of South Korea. So there's some internal issues when it comes to doing confidence building. Because when you're trusting someone, you need what? You need to build. You need the time, right? You're not going to build trust with a stranger. In the context of multilateral CBM, so I think the six-party talks was one of the big issues. It was around the denuclearization of North Korea. And one of the reasons why that party talk fell through was North Korea was money laundering. So in this context, I think I was trying to ask, why do CBMs fail? Right? And how do we build trust, especially in the context of North Korea today and in the context of complex interdependence, in the context of the digital age? So that was sort of the main question that I wanted to ask. And I think my personal observations are that CBMs are not enforced. So what that means is no parties are held accountable when trust is broken. So we have this new administration that says, oh, we're going to repeat the nostalgia of sunshine policy. We're going to repeat certain policies that our predecessors from the liberal government did. But there's a certain kind of assumption that that works, right? But no one was held accountable, right, for the fact that it didn't go through. Like Moon Jae-in's administration wasn't held accountable. The United States wasn't held accountable. So the problem with CBMs is that it's not reinforced, right? It's about accountability. Now, one thing that, as I mentioned, when it comes to a really big talk with the six-party talks around nuclear weapons, the issue that sabotaged that CBM was the money laundering system, right? And we see now more and more North Korea is getting highlighted, not only for its nuclear politics, but for its cybercrime, so-called. So if you do a full sort of report and analysis of U.S. Security, Department of Defense, all the reports that U.S. has been sort of working in terms of their sanctions, economic sanctions on North Korea, there's an internet sanctions on North Korea. And you see all of the lists of how both the U.S. Treasury, so this is released at the U.S. Department of Treasury, talking about the clandestine IT workers, right? Their funding. So there was something about the news, right? There's so much North Koreans that were actually working with some of the hiding themselves, right, as IT workers in the U.S. and they took a lot of money, right? And so the US has been really using this very securitization narrative around cybersecurity. And this was also very similar in the context of South Korea working with the US and creating working groups around cybersecurity. Now, cybersecurity discussions often center on traditional concepts of territorial sovereignty. You're invading our national economy, right? US and Russia, you're invading our our elections, right? You are impacting our democracy, right? That was one of the discussions with US and the interventions of Russia in the voting. But the digital space is increasingly becoming a contested domain for global security. Right, so it's also the conceptual part here where we're not able to actually imagine what the digital space is, right? So part of it is, so a lot of the case studies with North Korea. And I think what makes it really apparent with what's happening with Ukraine and Russia is one of the earliest models for CBM's confidence building measures were what? Crisis communication systems, hotlines between US and Soviet. It was established first during the Cuban Missile Crisis. What the Russia-Ukraine war makes apparent about the communication line is that it itself is a infrastructure. So initially it was a fiber optic cable, and now it's a satellite system. So all of these technical dimensions of conflict management infrastructure itself that was used for communication, trust building, becomes the target of war. So Russia and NATO has not been having these channels precisely because, oh, what if someone hacks our system, right? What if someone hacks our communication channels? So the very Cold War model of communication and trust building based on hotlines, even, what happened with South Korea and North Korea, we talk about North Korea destroying hotlines, right, between South Korea, are emblematic of something much larger, right? It's not just an interstate problem. And so what has been happening more recently, so the working groups at UN, ASEAN, all of these sort of international organizations have been trying to create a new discourse around CBMs and emerging tech, algorithms, AI. And mostly their discussion was sort of shifting away from the idea of military security, right? Russia, US, Russia, Ukraine, North Korea, South Korea, right? These are very territorial, state-centric understandings of the Cold War. What CBM actually makes, what confidence-building measures in the context of the digital age is really about complex interdependence. And so here I'll just sort of read sort of the passage from my paper, which sort of sums it up. So one section, so here I'm, in the paper itself, I actually talk about more deeply the specific issues that North Korea's cyber capabilities have, sort of the kind of policy and sanctions that came in relation to the Lazarus groups and different kinds of hacking groups in North Korea. But they've also used blockchain and decentralized finance, right? So digital technologies these days are dual use, civilian and military, and they themselves are embedded in a global critical infrastructure system. Energy grids, finance, telecommunication, making critical security concerns like the states, so US, Germany, and Australia, often continually make these security military agreements, security alliances, precisely because it's around infrastructure, global infrastructure, right? And so we see here energy, oil, right? We see the internet cable. So this is all internet cables, right? So if something happens with this internet cable, we don't have internet, right? And so all our economy, even our, even this PPT, will go away when this gets cut. So we have a global dependence on digital technologies and digital infrastructure, right? And so the paper sort of lays out the full ecosystem of blockchain and decentralized finance and all of this from software to hardware. They're all interconnected. And who has the monopoly over these dominant digital tech and companies? US, right? 90% of our data goes to Amazon Center, right? So we might be using Samsung phones, but we're actually paying to US. So if we actually understand the full economy of globalization and what we understand as the post-Cold War, right? This is what liberalism did, right? This is how we get K-pop, right? This is how we get Netflix, right? Within this US-dominated understanding, and that implicates the geopolitics, right? And so one thing that, I think in many ways we need a kind of conceptual reframing of the Cold War and post-liberal world order, which is predominantly based on a very old school Westphalian Eurocentric model of balance of power. And we actually have to look at how interconnected and how interdependent we are, and why North Korea's strategies in relation to cybercrime and nuclear North Korea is intelligible within this framework, right? But we still use the Cold War framework, and therefore we still have this very provincial, narrow way of thinking about confidence building measures because it's so bilateral or so state-centric. And as a result of that, we're only able to think about inter-Korean relations and North Korea in the deterrence and preemption framework, right? Precisely because we have a false understanding of global order and the sort of history of modernization, right? And so underlying this kind of critique is that modernization is colonization, but we don't see it. It's presented and sold to us as if it's something global and international. And so one thing that this also I guess, global infrastructure, the geologistical space makes really apparent is, for example, Pacific Islands do not have access to the digital divide because not many countries, so it's also who can pay for the internet, who can pay for the infrastructure, right? South Korea doesn't have a problem. But if you're in the islands, how are you going to get these cable cords connected? So the irony of this infrastructure is also that, all right, so we have these countries that are benefiting digitally, but all the countries that it's passing through do not have digital infrastructure, right? So this is something that the sort of folks who are doing CBMs are thinking about, okay, we need to up the digital divide for digital economy in the global market, but how do we do this, right? And so this overlaps with fundamentally maritime security and so on and so forth. So what we need is also, so I'm drawing from digital international relations, so rethinking the age of structure problem. So we need a conceptual intervention. So rethink CBMs from Cold War diplomacy, towards complex information interdependence, but in the context of how technology has emerged, internet has emerged because ARPANET, the internet itself was created as a nuclear anti-ballistic system, right, by the DoD. And so there is all this Cold War history of the internet and globalization. And so Robert J. Harner says, okay, increasingly we're not seeing hegemony. We're seeing state autonomy in the context of technological dependence, right? And I think he points out Russia, China, and North Korea as the three states that are following this logic. And he himself was working for the government for cybersecurity, and he's like, well, the government is not able to think about digital space, right? It's only thinking in terms of territoriality. And so I guess some of the questions I wanted to raise also was, how do we think North Korea out of this preemption deterrence cycle? And how do we think North Korea not as a pariah state, but as part of a Northeast regional architecture? So that's some of the ways in which I want to head towards. And I think one thing also, so I'll sort of wrap up my talk, but what you see with the digital infrastructure is you realize it's fundamentally hierarchical. And what, the kind of going back to IR and Bajolo is that they're still thinking within a very Western Eurocentric understanding of state systems. And they are still thinking as the world as anarchic, right? It's a still self-help system, and that's how they're able to talk about North Korea. But if we think about the world system, right, this kind of neo-Marxist Immanuel Wallerstein way of thinking about the world system, it's fundamentally hierarchical, right? It's fundamentally colonial. And so how do we sort of rethink this image, right, with North and South Korea? One's extremely digitally advanced. North Korea is the autocratic state that has no information, right, in a more critical lens, right, than the general way of understanding North Korea. Okay, thank you. I end here.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed all the papers and slides, reading the slides. And some of my questions, I have some questions for each of the presenters. And some of my questions have been answered while I listened to your presentation. I wrote down some of my thoughts. For Inho, I completely agree with your point that when reading historical documents, we need to use our imagination to interpret what is left unwritten. And for me, I think it is important for a researcher to read between the lines and trying to imagine the lives of the people of the time to approach their experiences, emotions, and senses, aspirations as human beings, as you exemplified by with the Qing invasion of Korea in the 17th century. And in academia, we are often bounded by conventional practices when writing for publication. And this is why I see Inho's presentation as an important initiative that goes beyond the standard academic paper. And it reflects a genuine curiosity to understand historical events, the lived reality of the past, and the worldview of the people at the time. And this also reflects a new trend in the study of international relations, and many scholars are shifting their focus toward non-state actors and non-traditional topics, and some scholars are experimenting with alternative forms of writing, such as poetry and autobiography, that move beyond the conventional formats of academic journals, and focusing less on objectivity, but more on fictional reconstruction of historical events. And I've known Inho for more than 15 years. And I think Inho is one of the revolutionaries in IR, someone who tries to find his own voice against the mainstream. Since he said this paper will be, research will be developed further, I have two questions to ask for clarification. First, I'm curious about how you define strange in the context of strange politics. Are you using any references for this concept? What would you consider its opposite meaning? Would it be normal politics or modern politics? If so, how would you differentiate between strange and normal politics? Alternatively, there could be other terms such as unconventional politics or politics of uniqueness, maybe. And second, as a researcher in academia within the disciplinary boundaries of IR, what kind of things or training do you think are important to do this kind of alternative practice, such as writing a fictionalized history? I know you have been engaging with what you consider meaningful in your research on the East Asian International Order, other than just writing an academic paper. So if you could share how you've been trying to do some weird things in a good way, seemingly unrelated to the academic activities, I think it would help us better understand your perspective and research.
Okay. First of all, before I respond to our discussion, I kind of feel the sort of need to justify. I was the kind of person who invited all these wonderful panelists, and I kind of feel the need to justify having 3 distinct papers, which spans like 1,500 years. So I guess our first thought was to sort of collect papers and topics that kind of provides more sort of unconventional, in my case, strange narratives about Korean history, which is not usually talked about in academia and in also public space. So that's kind of the why we have papers that span through such a long period of time. Back to the questions. They are wonderful questions. The strange politics. I kind of came just to this objective because when you read the pre-modern histories, not just Korean ones, but the other European, Islamic, and Indian histories, I think there are certain experiences and practices that feels really strange to especially moderns who I think it's not universal, but a lot of modern people share certain sort of scientific conception of the world on the one hand, and also kind of modern ideas about politics and economy, and that's, I believe, kind of forms our sort of basic conceptual framework for understanding our world. And then when you see historical actors acting sort of outside that boundary, I think that then we kind of feel strange, and so that's how I define strangeness. Throughout training, officially I didn't go through any kind of training in fiction writing or what else, but I am interested in fictions and novels and poetry. So I believe those interest in more sort of literary way of writing definitely helps, because in those fields, what really seems to me matters is that how well you actually captures the actual feelings and experience of those who lived in certain space and time, and that's how those more literary writings kind of differs from more academic-oriented history writing, and I believe that definitely have. But I don't think that's, we necessarily kind of have to write a fiction about like certain period. We can just try to incorporate those more sort of literary way of expression into our academic writings as well. Thank you.
For Jae-young's paper is truly fascinating, and I remember reading 삼국유사 and 삼국사기 when I was young, but I've never considered using it as a source for research. The text contain a rich source of information about international relations in the earlier period. Jae-young's paper not only examines the East Asian tributary system, but also explores state formation during the Three Kingdoms era, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, in the Korean Peninsula. I see this as a pioneering effort that seeks to build theory on the basis of empirical research. I especially appreciate the descriptive analysis of the relationship between war making and state building as illustrated through the Three Kingdoms. I cannot imagine the painstaking effort to count the number of wars and military activities by analyzing the articles in 삼국사기. And as a reader, the tables are particularly helpful in making this period more comprehensible. And for Jae-young, I have broadly two questions. My first question concerns the relationship between war making and state formation. The paper shows that Silla's advancements in governance, its military and taxation systems, as well as local administration, took shape during its wars with its neighbors in the 6th century. And this effectively illustrates how Silla consolidated its bureaucracy while preparing for both external conflict and internal power struggles. And I wonder, though, whether you also plan to analyze the cases of Goguryeo and Baekje in the same way to further explore the link between war and state formation. I understand that the example of unified Silla demonstrates well how the state makes war and war makes states. However, it doesn't explain why Goguryeo and Baekje failed to unify the whole countries during the same period. So personally, I think expanding the analysis to include all three kingdoms might strengthen the overall argument, I think. And second, in contrast to the existing literature on the East Asian International Order, which focuses on the Ming and Qing eras, this paper directs attention to an earlier period, and as your paper argues, analyzing the three kingdoms can provide a framework for rethinking the regional order in East Asia. And during this time, Confucianism was not yet the overarching principle shaping interstate or intrastate relations. So I want to ask, what should define the culture of East Asia during this period that covers all Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla? And with this in mind, if your goal is to theorize the East Asian International Order in the earlier period, what do you see as its defining characteristics? Alternatively, are you also aiming to develop a broader theory that covers from the 1st century BC to the 19th century? That's, so I want to ask the purpose of this article. And one minor thing is that on table 4, I'm wondering why the number of conflicts between the three kingdoms doesn't match in the first row of the table. For example, the number of warfare between Baekje and Goguryeo is 32 on the first column and 33 on the second column, so it doesn't match in the warfare. And also, as for the table 1, it would be more helpful if you include specific time span for each dynasties, matching China and Korea.
Okay, thanks for reading quite a long paper. Yeah, so two main comments from Jie. First of all, I started this research as a journal article manuscript, but Jie's comments more about how I can develop this thing into a book project. So it's pushing me to a little bit further. So first of all, yes, as Jie pointed out, one of the main purpose of this article is to challenge the conventional wisdom in historical IR literature, especially the literature in historical East Asia, was that it was a tributary system under Chinese hegemony, so it was very peaceful, and Confucianism was the ideological building block of this peace and stability under Chinese hegemony. But I wanted to challenge this point because if we look at the records of produced by the Korean peoples, especially those who lived in the ancient period, there were so many wars and conflict and violence among the Korean polities. Even though we call them Korean polities, it remains uncertain whether or not they see each other as a part of one great nation like today. So I wanted to challenge this kind of presentism and projecting the image of modern Korea or China backwards to the ancient historical East Asia. So in that sense, I thought we can see the relationship between these polities located on the Korean Peninsula more like a relationship between different states. So in that sense, war making and state making were closely related to one another in the case of ancient Korea. So as Jie pointed out, I focus on the case of Silla for strategic reasons, because Silla is the final victor of this three kingdoms period. So Silla is the most useful case to present my argument. Of course, there are many records about Goguryeo and Baekje, but the problem is that the main source I am relying on this research is Samguk-sagi, produced in the later in Goryeo dynasty, which came after Silla, and the leader of this project that produced the Samguk-sagi was Kim Bu-sik, who was the descendant of the Silla royal family. So there is some kind of bias, and there were not so much a record about Goguryeo and Baekje, but there are definitely scattered articles about state formation that gives us some hints about state formation in Goguryeo and Baekje. So I'm going to try to incorporate these Baekje and Goguryeo elements in the later version. And second, Confucianism culture, so grand theory making. So basically, I'm not sure what's going to be the final outcome of this project, but my point, my main argument in the current version of this manuscript is that we need, even if we are talking about historical East Asia, we are not sufficiently historicizing historical East Asia. So for instance, Korea and China, they have a very long history of interaction, which is spanned over very many, several centuries. But most of the literature on Korea in historical East Asia is now focused on the Joseon Korea's relationship with the Chinese empires. So it is only one pattern or one type of interaction between Korean and Chinese politics. So my suggestion is that we need to extend the scope of analysis and relativize the special relationship between Joseon Korea and the Ming or Qing China. So I should think more about how to incorporate Chia's second comments in my later manuscripts. And the minor point about some kind of discrepancy between within the table. So the main reason is that what I counted in this article, in this manuscript, is the number of the articles, not the battles. So there are some discrepancies between the numbers and the total columns. So there are that is a technical issue. So I want to add some comments about the reason of this discrepancy in the next graph.
For Dr. Yeon-hee Kim, I really enjoyed reading your paper, and I really appreciate your overview of the history of confidence-building measures, or CBMs, taken in the Korean Peninsula since the aftermath of the Korean War. As someone who is not an expert in the subject, I learned a lot while reading your paper. From my understanding, CBMs are grounded in a liberal perspective, liberal institutionalism that emphasizes cooperation among actors in global politics. And traditionally, CBMs have been adopted to prevent military conflicts by addressing prisoner's dilemma type of situation. For example, as the paper explains, reducing the risk of miscalculation through credible signaling of intentions. The paper clearly demonstrates how the changing global context challenges this traditional approach, particularly with the emergence of cyber attacks, cryptocurrencies, and so on. So these technologies create new kinds of threats that cannot be addressed in the same way as conventional warfare or arms control. And I think this is a timely research with practical policy implications for the South Korean government. And based on my reading, I have 3 broad questions. First, I would like to ask how you think the final output of this paper. As I read it, the paper seems to be organized around 3 main parts: the history of inter-Korean relations, alongside the emergence of new digital technologies. Second, North Korea's capabilities and uses of new technologies. And third, digital CBMs as a new framework for addressing 21st century security threats, in addition to policy recommendations for the Ministry of Unification. And I like the comprehensive discussion of the history and contemporary practices of CBMs. And I think so my question is how you aim to publish this article. So please correct me if I'm mistaken. I think there is a slight shift in perspective. The first part of the paper reads as more neutral, maintaining some distance from both North and South Korea, while showing how traditional CBMs worked relatively well under the bipolar structure, with both Koreas making efforts toward peaceful coexistence. However, in the later sections appear more policy-oriented, speaking more directly to the South Korean government. So if you are trying to be more neutral to both sides, both South and North Koreas, I'd like to ask what are the challenges that makes it difficult for North Korea to trust South Korea in the new context? Or if you're trying to give more practical advice to the South Korean government, I'd like to ask, what is the ultimate goal of the CBMs? And this question is related to my second question. So the paper discusses public diplomacy that goes beyond state-centric approaches to include non-state actors, which is particularly relevant in the digital age. However, in the context of inter-Korean relations, I find it difficult to see how this could be pursued through civil society, given North Korea's regime type and the technological asymmetries between the two sides. It seems difficult to expect meaningful communication channels with North Korean society in digital spaces. So with this in mind, I would like to ask, who do you see as the potential counterparts to civil society organizations in North Korea? And further, how could non-traditional issues such as healthcare or food security, as you mentioned in the paper, serve as possible entry points for engagement in relation to cybersecurity? And finally, I want to ask how much you consider inter-Korean relations important to the broader discussion of CBMs on the Korean Peninsula. The paper points to the 2019 Hanoi Summit as the turning point that signaled the failure of traditional measures. However, the Hanoi Summit was primarily about the relationship between North Korea and the United States. So in this regard, I wonder how much leverage the South Korean government has in implementing CBMs in its relations with North Korea, apart from the influence of emerging technologies as structural forces in the international system.
Thank you. I don't know if I can answer all those questions, but thank you for all these points. There is definitely a change in the origin, right? So this paper was originally conceived under a different political administration. And so, I think one thing that I want to do is make this into a more critical, because I had some time to kind of reread my paper and sort of rethink about it. And part of presenting it was also to kind of get this feedback in the context of right now. And I would say that first of all, I do want to sort of restage it by sort of critiquing a lot of the Western scholars on IR and digital, right? And as you've mentioned, right, there's this new emerging thing about digital peace building, and it's also very hot in Europe about how do we use this current digital technologies and social media to peace build, right? But it's sort of an extension of what you said, the liberal regimes. And so I think in hindsight, sort of being able to also even look at my paper, sort of some of the conceptual limits of it. So that's definitely the point that I will be making in sort of a different version. In terms of CBMs and military conflict, again, CBMs has a long history. It has many different contexts and how it's been working in different situations. It's also tried to adapt to the global order, because CBMs are about security architectures, right? So it's not only about interstate, but I think what's interesting about this idea of building trust with counterparts that you are at war or you have enmity with. So it was more of that question of you are supposed to kill each other, but you're also going to build trust. So there's this really deep paradox of confidence building measures. And I was interested in, and if you sort of understand inter-Korean CBMs, you see that, it's like Park Chung-hee and Kim Il-sung meet and they're negotiating family reunions, right? And they have this idea of how do we not do political, right? But then, you see a lot of the ways in which then what do we need to do to build trust, right? And so I think those were more of the questions that I wanted to also think about. And, I think one of the obstacles, and I think one of the key things that really limit South Korea from engaging this, because I don't see CBMs just as an interstate thing. I think conflict resolution, confidence building is necessary for democracy, right? We're seeing a deeply ideologically polarized society. What do you need? You need trust in the other and being able to have certain conversations, I think. And so it's more of, I think, a deeper problem than just a specific historical conflicts. And the way I see that sort of emerge, and I guess sort of I've been thinking about confidence building as more of an expansive, like how do we build trust? And you know, like I would do a workshop on North Korea and to North Korean defectors, and like you just see certain limitations. You have a national security law, right? You can't have trust when you're not yourself, right? So there's all these more micro sociological limitations where I think inter-Korean relations has carried on that estrangement. So I think what we're dealing with is young South Korean people not interested in reunification or North Korea. This is like estrangement that is politically engineered for 70 years on a social level. And it's the fact that the interstate monopolizes it, right? And so CBMs, and I keep talking about it and thinking about it precisely because we need to get it outside of certain ways of historicizing relations between inter-Korean. And even, like you said, it's like South Korean government, US, North Korea. But I was working in a grassroots campaign. It's a transnational network of women from Hawaii, Okinawa, because their US military bases are related with the Korean War. So we have so much like understanding of who are the stakeholders when it comes to this conflict. And so, I mean, again, that's sort of the beyond scope of the paper, but I'm sort of considering, and public diplomacy was a very like, you know, neutral way of putting it, but it's like, how do we get people to see themselves as stakeholders of this larger problem, global infrastructure, climate change, I mean, weaponization, all of this is our problem. It gets intensified and re-securitized in the context of Korea and gets reused by the state. And I think just sort of unteasing that is important and not being very skeptical when states engage in inter-Korean talks because, you know, you have to build trust. And that's to avoid violence, right? Like actual violence. You're trying to preempt violence and killing each other. And I think that's the stakes of CBM. And I think if we only think about it as policy and in the context of presidential exchange, we lose the existential stakes when we do not build confidence in each other and in the systems we live in, right? And I think that's something we're seeing globally. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, everyone. I could keep listening to all of you the whole time, but I also want to give some minutes to the audience to just share comments or thoughts you have, questions you have. If you have it for a specific speaker, please make sure to specify that. I think I will pass around this microphone, but if people just raise their hand, I can have a look at how many we have, and if you guys are okay with it, we'll just collect some questions and then give you a chance to answer. Who wants to ask a question?
Hi, thank you so much for 3 very interesting papers, and I think this is a very interesting panel. Like it's a cross section of, you know, strangeness and otherness, but I think there are a lot of spaces in between. So, and thank you for the discussion of trying to piece things together. But, you know, I think, yeah, what the third paper has got. I'm actually using, you know, what I think as a direction of the third paper to ask the first 2 papers. You know, I completely appreciate, you know, the value of history as a kind of academic pursuit. But I'm just wondering if you have the purpose of, you know, your focus in this paper has got some implications for the present. Like, why do you want to point out these strange or estranged part of history or othered part of history? And is there a, you know, is there a message or a point you want to make as a precedence or as a message to the present?
Yeah, it's very interesting to listen. So many, compared to my age, the new people. I was a student one time in Seoul National University, did PhD from here, Wegehakwa. I see so many things changed in Korea. I come time to time, but Korea has changed a lot. SNU also has changed a lot. And so does the inter-Korean relations. So my question is to Yeon-hee, that a few months before, a North Korean diplomat, he came to our university and he spoke. And he told that actually what South Korea is dealing, that opinion in North Korea is controlled by only 10-15% top people. Rest of North Korea has nothing to do what is going on. And listening to you, also I think that in South Korea also, what the ruling system, and it changes drastically, how they view North Korea, that is imposed from top to bottom. So in this context, what can be the real CBMs, maybe in the traditional form, that can actually create what you can say the trust building or the reconciliation? As we know also that the mass media talks about that the young people in South Korea, they are not interested. And listening to North Korea has also moved to much closer to Russia, and they are also not interested in unification, and they are interested in something big. We don't know. So I would like to listen to you what new, maybe from the North Korea that is not represented, and the South Korea opinion that is not represented. What can be the new CBMS to focus on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I have some questions or somewhat like curiosity to Dr. Jae-young Kim. So I thought that like your argument about three kingdom period was pretty familiar to Koreans, but like, because like if you learned history in Korea as Guksa, then we all kind of like perceive Goguryeo, Baekje, Silla, all three different independent countries, but like it is not pretty known to the other academia in like political science or history. So I think your research is really necessary at this point, and then I really appreciate your efforts. But like I was wondering if like some readers ask you about the sources to cross-check your argument. I was just curious if there are any English translations of 삼국유사 or 삼국사기. And also especially for 삼국유사, it contains a lot of fictional stories in there. So I was also wondering if like even though I really appreciate your efforts of counting the battles and the articles, but like I was wondering how trustworthy that record is. And also, I have one more point related to the first commenter. So that like, because you are still telling about the story of more than 1,000 years ago, and I think it would be better to highlight once again how that history means to contemporary academia. So that like we had the history of three independent countries, they were not like tribute to China, and then what it means to contemporary Korea or China or to other people who are interested in Korea. So thank you.
Okay, I'll take the question. Thank you for the question. So I guess I think it's difficult, right? And I think, so I'll just maybe start with anecdote. So the other day I was at a conference or a panel that was predominantly North Korean defector researchers. So it was North Korean defector researchers on North Korea, right? Because they had a much more nuanced understanding of media and North Korea's information ecosystem. And, oftentimes they're looking at North Korea through this very media authoritarian lens. And one of the things they were looking at was North Korean social media and the ways in which a lot of North Koreans in North Korea, well, it's basically the party, right? They have the social media account, and it's a lot of young women that are enjoying everyday life. And we see in IG, Instagram, right, and Twitter, like people going to Wonsan and going to these newly opened tourism sites, right? And so one of the things that when I saw the image, I was thinking maybe in ways in how US generally thinks, right? Which is, oh, if we go to a country, we have a military, right? A safe military will make the place safe, right? A conflict zone safe. And what does that allow? It allows for foreign investors to come in. So you always need military for foreign investors to flow. So economic development is always in relation to military security. And I said, what if North Korea is sort of wanting to be normalized as a nuclear state, right? It's currently really pushing for that. And since Kim Jong-un has declared the new constitution, Pyeongjin, which basically says North Korea economy and North Korean military are inseparable, right? And people are not really taking the constitution seriously, right? But from that lens, I think North Korea is also presenting an image. We have nuclear weapons. We're not like Iran and Iraq. We're safe for foreign investors, and not necessarily traditional foreign investors like in Europe, but for Russia, China, Vietnam, Laos, Belarus, right? And so I think it actually reproduces certain neoliberal logics of economic security and military security. And so I think in that sense, you know, if South Korea were to do confidence building measures, right, it's sort of trying to, I think, enlarge our understanding and sort of push back on misconceptions about North Korea's strategies. Because if we only read it as propaganda, we don't actually understand these are strategic moves in the context of the global market, right? And so, you know, that's sort of the outside scope. And I think if we think North Korea in that futuristic sense, right, in the speculative sense, and the digital divide between North Korea and Russia, China, right? They manage their social media system, and Korea, Japan. It's a border, right? And so then organizations like ASEAN or UN, like how are they going to talk about regional security through this lens, right? Not just the nuclear weapons in the specific region, but digital. So my paper is mostly about trying to stage those conversations. I think in terms of inter-Korean, there's I don't see much room. And I think something that you mentioned, and I didn't get to say, but North Korea wants to normalize relations with US, right? Most of North Korea's literature and textbooks about US, not South Korea. But South Korea tends to present it into context of civil war, right? So I think they have very different imaginaries about what the Korean War is and what geopolitics is. And so that's itself a narrative. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll just sort of wrap up there. Yeah.
So thank you for the comment. So the contemporary relevance of the strange history. In a sense, I think this is a form of CBM. I think they built trust through this exchange of strangely looking remarks, very respectful toward each other. But it's not like temporary thing. It's that sort of gestures and relations was built through like centuries of ritualized territory exchanges, and that's how they built their more trustworthy relationship. And I think that shows what can be done in the future if we are able to develop such different styles of diplomacy through a very long-term ritualized engagement. So I think that's the value of strange forms of past history. Thank you.
Thanks for the comments and questions. So first, the practical or contemporary implication of this research. So it's quite very practical. So because of the rise of China, there is a growing scholarly interest about the regional orders that existed before the arrival of the West or the global expansion of the Westphalian system. But the problem of the current academia is that whenever you go to major international conferences that deal with this topic, what we are seeing is that many people are replacing Eurocentrism or Western centrism with Sinocentrism. So another exchange of centrism, which does violence to history. So I wanted to challenge this kind of tendency by bringing the voices or history of non-Chinese or non-hegemony actors that remained outside of the purview of many scholars. And the problem of this kind of historical narrative is that it is intentionally or unintentionally provides the misleading image about the region. So it has a very practical implication. For instance, when China does some coercive action against its neighboring countries, many people might have a misleading interpretation. Oh, China has always done that, so it is not so strange. But the truth, I think historical reality was quite different from this kind of a typical image we have about the region. So Korea in that sense, Korea is a very special case because it has a very institutionalized and stable relationship for nearly 5 centuries. But if we go back a little bit further to the more distant past, the story was quite different. And my suggestion here is that when we talk about historical East Asia, we need to really historical perspective. So even though the historical record says that, oh, this kingdom in Korea paid tributes to the Chinese dynasty, but the meaning of tribute can vary across time, depending on the power distribution or which ideology or tradition was dominant in the region. So this is just the beginning step toward further historicization of historical East Asia. So in that sense, Korean sources, there are many mythical elements. So probably I'm practicing Ino's fictionalized history of my own. So that is the challenge I'm now facing. So, but combining the theoretical insights and the historical sources and finding some, unchanging truth, that is my task for the next draft. But thanks for the comments.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think it's very clear how the logic of how these papers came together, even though it didn't look like it beforehand. But I really want to thank the speakers, the discussant, but also all of you in the room, and really enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.